Hello and welcome to the Ancient Jesus Future Faith podcast. My name is Tana Sheaver and I'm here with Sarah Minardi.
Hello.
And Don Sheaver.
Hi.
And today we're going to be talking about women in the Bible. And I wanted to start off with this by asking you, Sarah, what your experience has been as a woman in the church. And I think I'm going to leave this question pretty broadly open for you to respond to in terms of it could be how you've been treated as a woman or what you were taught about women or specific scripture interpretations, whatever, however you want to respond to that, things that maybe affected you growing up.
Yeah, I grew up in the Catholic Church, so the role of women in the church was very limited, and only seeing men in the role of priest and leaders, and even growing up, they had altar boys, the children who were allowed to assist during the Mass with different parts of the Mass, and there were no altar girls. I believe
Right.
now...
I never realized that. I mean,
Yeah.
it's obvious when you say it, but I never thought about that even there's all, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
My brother was an altar boy.
Yeah. And I went to Catholic school too. And I believe now they have altar girls. Because I feel like kind of like as I moved up out of the Catholic faith or past the age of doing that they started opening it up. I might be wrong about that. But yeah, so it was just, even though nothing was said necessarily, it wasn't like there were signs and posters around that men are great and only, But it's like when you go to Mass every week and that's what you see
Right.
leading, and you know that just because you're a girl, you can't be an altar boy. And I didn't ask a lot of questions about it at the time. Again, being young, it was just like, well, this just is the way it is. And, but I think I carried that with me much more than I realized growing up, because I never thought that I could have a leadership position in a church, because I just never saw that modeled.
Yeah, and I grew up in the Catholic Church too, so very similar experience. Now I went to the attached Catholic school as well, so almost all of my teachers at that Catholic school were female, and most of them were nuns. So I saw a leadership position in that way, which I think a lot of churches do, where, the women are allowed to teach the kids, but that's it. But yeah, altar boys, priests, yeah, that was all always men in charge.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's about it.
I had an interesting, I'm trying to think of how to get into this, because I feel like I got a lot of mixed messages growing up, right? Like in the church, it was very much like, oh, men have the leadership roles. But then outside of the church, there were definitely a lot of things that were still keeping women back, like certain attitudes, particularly about like boys will be boys and that kind of thing. And there were still things like where boys were more encouraged in math and science than women were, or little girls were, and things like that. So it is this interesting, like I feel like female empowerment was growing at that time,
Right?
But it also wasn't like fully taking hold. So it felt like a lot of really strange mixed messages. And I switched from Catholicism to what was it? Church of God when I was a teenager, and there were still those gender barriers there.
Yeah.
And even though in my mind I was always like, well, I can do anything.
That was a big message for us growing up, right?
Yeah.
We can do anything, but then
Right.
the reality...
But if doesn't it feel like that message got a little shortchanged though? Because I remember thinking that, but then I remember going to a church like as a guest, and a woman was the preacher, and I was so uncomfortable. And I remember feeling a little confused by that.
Yeah, like, what am I supposed to think about this?
Right. It was this strange thing where I'm like, oh, like there's a core part of me that was like, women can do anything, but then there was also this, like, because it was always taught to me, like, like women aren't preachers. Women aren't priests. Women, you know. And so it was like I was profoundly uncomfortable, and because of that messaging.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going along with as you were sharing, and I was thinking that myself. I'm like, yeah, I strongly from that generation, the message that we can do anything, and the world not matching that.
Yes.
And even like when I would, as a girl, play mass in the basement, and I would be the priest and take my first communion book and go through the whole mass, there was a part of me that wondered if I was like not supposed to do that. Like,
right.
Like, is God going to be mad at me? Or like, you know, like, is this something
that you're doing something subversive?
Yeah.
Yeah.
By like saying the mass.
Yeah.
With my stuffed animals and toast and juice.
It's so funny because if you're listening to or watching and you didn't catch this episode before, Sarah and I both shared that when we were younger, we would play mass with our dolls and stuffed animals and stuff. But yeah, and it also, I felt the same way. Like, am I doing something wrong? Am I, will God be mad?
Yeah.
That I'm doing this? Yeah. So very, very mixed messages. And I don't know about you. I think if I recall from our conversation about this before, your sort of introduction into evangelicalism was a little bit later than mine. Mine was in the teenage years.
Yes, mine was more college.
Okay. So I got full blast purity culture. Did you get any of that?
No.
No. Okay. So for me, the growing up as a woman in the church, as a teenager, I got, and I would say I got maybe some of this in the Catholicism too, but much more intensely in the more evangelical world. This whole purity culture thing of where it was almost as if like men could do whatever they wanted, and boys could do whatever they wanted. Boys will be boys. But girls were supposed to guard themselves, and we were supposed to be pure and chaste. And I think we mentioned this one time before, maybe, about how like you're a chewed up piece of gum if you've had sex before marriage. And so who wants a chewed up piece of gum? Who wants something used, So that definitely affected me as well. But I feel like there are stories in the Bible that contradict all of that, but that sometimes those stories are told in ways that undermine the female empowerment message that goes with them.
Or the stories of the women in the Bible just aren't talked about nearly as much.
Also true. And I'm thinking about the shirt you're wearing right now, which if you can't see it, it says Jesus protected women, empowered women, honored women publicly, released the voice of women, confided in women, was funded by women, celebrated women by name, learned from women, respected women, and spoke of women as examples to follow. Our turn. I love your shirt, by the way.
Yeah. Happy Givers.
Oh, is that like the name of the company?
Yeah, it's a nonprofit. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Oh, shout out to Happy Givers. So what are some of those verses that we've either overlooked or misinterpreted?
Well, one of my favorite things when maybe probably a year or more now, in our community at church, and we were really in Exodus, like we were like just deep dive into Exodus, which is just amazing, and could live in the Exodus story probably for the rest of my life and be happy. But just the conversation around Exodus 1 and pointing out the role of the Hebrew midwives who and just how Pharaoh tells them specifically, like, kill the firstborn, and they don't do that. They say that the Hebrew women are delivering so quickly that they can't get to it. And just this subversive act, and then just noticing and looking at the text that they are named by name, and the Pharaoh and Pharaoh's daughter are never named by name. And just that little bit of emphasis given to them because we know them by name. Although right now I forget their names, which is terrible. But
do you remember which chapter of Exodus?
Exodus 1, yeah.
Oh, it's right at the beginning.
Yeah. Because we're getting this preamble into this Exodus story which is going to continue. I mean, and then leading right into it, even Moses' mother deciding not to, or hiding Moses' sister playing the role of protector. Just in a short little bit of scripture, we see so much of women where if they had not done what they had done, the whole story would be changed.
Right.
And in growing up and in the church, we hear a lot about Moses, and yes, Moses, amazing, but Moses wouldn't be Moses without his sister and his mom.
Moses
and the Hebrew
literally
midwives.
does nothing in that story except for lay in a basket.
Yeah.
Like that's his
Lazy guy.
entire bit for
Yeah.
this piece. I mean, obviously, as the Exodus story goes on, his role becomes bigger, but even his sister remains a large role in it as the story goes on. But yeah.
Yeah, and it's just making me, just as soon as you said that, I'm like, you know how we refer to stories as like little sayings or similar like chapter headings. And when I think of that story, I think, oh, the baby in the basket. And here, even though it's a baby, I'm still thinking of the male character and summing up the story with the male character that was just the baby in the basket.
Yeah, we should rename that pericope.
Yes.
Midwives and Daughters.
Yeah.
Oh.
Because
I like
it's
that.
Yeah.
midwives and daughters that, Pharaoh's worried about the boys. And
Yeah.
that's his entire focus. Kill the firstborn male. And then we find out in the next chapter, nope, it's all the daughters that are going to overturn this oppressive regime. And I absolutely love it.
Yeah.
I did not ever really fully notice that the midwives were named.
Yeah.
Like, are there other moments where a seemingly, like, at first glance, unimportant character is named? Or I guess there are.
Well, I think of it in the New Testament. I think of it with Jesus in some of the lists. We see female names that we might not even recognize as female, and some have some debate around it because heaven forbid that it's a female listed as an apostle, or I think it's Junia or Junius.
Yeah.
And Susanna, there's not much said in the Bible, but Susanna is one of the names listed with Priscilla, the wife of Aquila, and there's another woman named in that, maybe Phoebe around that time, or Phoebe's named as a deaconess. There's all these little mentions of women being very active in the ministry of the early Christian church, which was quite countercultural.
And almost all the benefactors to Jesus early on were women. It was women that were supporting Jesus' ministry, like financially.
Lydia being one, I think.
Yeah, that I'm actually disappointingly weak in remembering names.
Yeah.
Oh, don't look at me.
But I think the fact that their names appear, too, and that the authors thought that it was important to list these women's names in these lists of who was in the ministry. And I think that that's very significant because in that culture, in that time, I think it could have been easy for them to leave them out because they didn't say very much about them. But, that extra effort of like putting in these names in these lists, I think is significant.
Yeah.
That they wanted to accurately reflect that women were a part of this. And I think that was, maybe Don, you could speak more to what that would have been like in that time. But in that time, women wouldn't have been discipled by rabbis.
So it's mixed, right? I think kind of like churches today, right, where there's a lot of denominations that do allow women to, and that's even just saying it that way sounds terrible, but women have just as much right to the pulpit as men do. Mm-hmm. So in those days, we do find women elevated in houses of study and in relationships with sages and teachers. I don't think we have anything that is nearly as consistent as the recordings of Jesus with that. and whether that is a symbol or a signal to us that Jesus was way more proactive in that, and women felt more welcomed to participate at higher levels, might be the case. It might also just be we don't have a ton of writings around the day-to-day activities of rabbis. We more so have discussions and debates around theology or philosophy and that type of thing, but not a whole lot. Like the New Testament has actually been, this is kind of an aside, is, I think the New Testament is the oldest recording of a Passover Seder. The New Testament is also one of the oldest recordings of the celebration of Hanukkah, called the Festival of Lights in the book of John. So the New Testament is unique, but we would be, I would just hesitate to say that it wasn't happening anywhere else. And I know that's not what you said, I'd hesitate for anyone thinking that it wasn't happening anywhere else, because that would be like implying because a Passover Seder is only really mentioned in the New Testament, well, therefore no one else was celebrating the Passover, or because the Festival of Lights is only mentioned in the New Testament that no one else was celebrating. So there's something definitely here. And I think one of the things we see is that if Jesus is indeed God manifested in flesh, no pun intended with manifested, then what it only makes sense that women would be very active in Jesus's ministry based on things we see from the Exodus narrative, things that we see in the creation narrative, language around God being the many-breasted one. All of these things very much point to a femininity of God and God's love of female. And because of that, we shouldn't be shocked that Jesus carries that one.
So let's talk about the femininity that you mentioned, Don. There's also a lot of feminine terms used to describe God throughout Scripture, and I feel like we ignore those as well, and that also contributes to the over masculinity of Christianity. I don't know how to word that. And if this is a direction you two don't want to go down, that's that's fine. But that it was something that occurred to me as you were talking, is that, well, not only do we skip over the stories of women, but we also skip over the femininity of God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything to that?
No, the only example I think is the one you already brought up that I think of immediately is the El Shaddai. And what is that usually?
Lord God Almighty.
Yeah, Almighty, instead of the many-breasted one.
And the many-breasted one should be Almighty.
Yeah.
Right? I don't necessarily have a problem it gets tagged as Almighty, but I want to carry the heart behind it, right? That the nurturer, the mother is Almighty.
Yeah.
Is actually a really powerful picture. So I don't necessarily want to get rid of Almighty and only read El Shaddai as the many-breasted one, but I want the church to embrace Almighty as an expression of femininity, or an expression of woman, that I think is really significant.
Yeah, because maybe it's just the Western lens, but I've recently becoming more and more aware how certain words have value based on my Western lens that isn't really necessarily there. Either like thinking of Almighty and not even realizing that I carry like that is a male adjective, or like has this slight maleness to it.
Yep.
If I'm honest.
Yep.
Or in other examples of other stories, just thinking of how a word like more in the Western lens is very positive, like more, give it your all, like that idea, and suddenly looking at words and realizing like, wait a minute, if I try to take away the Western lens that tells me that this is positive all the time, then it becomes a little bit more neutral and a little bit more open to interpretation. But yeah, I'm just realizing how I carry lenses into certain words. that it takes you giving that description and that caveat around it to get past of Almighty. Because if it's just Almighty, then it goes to God, which like in general I carry as like male.
Yeah.
Because of exactly what we're talking about.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Let me just say real quick too about El Shaddai is that if at all you want to see evidence that the kind of the is it etymology of the word for El Shaddai is I wasn't sure because I know that word's very close to study
Entomology?
of ants, very close to the study of ants.
Well, bugs in general.
Bugs in general,
Yeah.
and
No, that entomology would be about ants.
No. Oh boy. All right, so leave the dad jokes to me.
Okay.
So I think it's really interesting is that when you look at where the text refers to God as El Shaddai, it's almost always in discussions of descendants, which is really beautiful. That God is referred to as El Shaddai when God is making promises of descendants or there's childbirth about to happen. That is almost a hint to us in the story that what we're about to experience is a nurturing, a birthing, a history. So anyhow, fun little thing for you all to explore in your free time.
Yeah, and have you mentioned before that in the Jewish faith that you're Jewish if your mother's Jewish?
Yes.
Not if your father.
That is correct.
Yeah.
You must be born of a Jewish woman to be considered Jewish. And again, the power that holds, right? I mean, that's significant. Yeah.
Yeah, and it might seem like a silly thing, but something I've thought about in the past is that the story isn't that like God came down and blessed Joseph's or some other man's seed, and then there was a woman, and then she gave birth, and like that was the birth story. Like the story is immaculate conception of a Jewish woman, and then she gives birth. Like the blessing and the story comes through the woman, and Joseph is sort of like there, but not really involved.
Right.
And so I just always thought that was interesting as well. And I realized, you could probably just say, well, that's just, the mechanics of birth. That's how it works. But I mean, it could have been told a different way.
Well, and this is where I think the way that, that the church tells stories impacts the way that we make assumptions about the Bible, right? Like when we think about, well, why isn't it ever the man's fault that the woman can't get pregnant, right?
Right.
But you can also read this as the world grows and fails upon the womb of a woman, and that it's that power that is going to dictate the future of Israel. That's, if you view it from that perspective or attempt to try and see it from that perspective, all of a sudden it's actually emphasizing the importance of the womb. And it's not blaming the woman for not being able to get pregnant. It's that the woman is so important to the story and to the future of the story that if the womb is barren, it threatens all of Israel's history. And it's not condemning that. It's actually demonstrating just how important it is. And so there's a lot of things in the text like that, from my perspective, that we have applied a lens of misogyny or a lens of patriarchy or whatever. And so when we read a passage, we assume that fits within our own patriarchal thinking. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, let me talk, if you don't mind, about a couple different places that are important. Because, Sarah, you alluded to this when you were kind of sharing your experience growing up in the church and everything, and about whether or not the women in the New Testament were demonstrated as disciples or what have you. and I don't think most churches teach that women were disciples, even with Jesus, right? Like I think there's been a huge effort to deny that, whether that be like the Junia, et cetera. So a couple places I think that we can just look real quick that demonstrate, and so much so as an aside, that it's like it implies that it's a given that women were disciples. And that would be the story of Mary and Martha. Mm-hmm. And, Jesus goes into their home, and Martha is doing a bunch of stuff, serving the people there, taking care of the needs of the people that are there that are discipled by Jesus. And it says, and Mary was sitting at his feet. And that language is reserved for discipleship. You sit at when you say you're sitting at someone's feet, it has a discipleship implication to it. So that would be one, and it's kind of said as an aside. That's not the point of the story, so to speak. And then another example is, if you remember the story where Jesus's mother and brothers show up and knock on the door and tell Jesus that his mother and brothers are here. And it says, and Jesus was in with his disciples teaching. Mm-hmm. And he said, and he looks around the room and he says, you are my mothers and brothers and sisters. Mm-hmm. So the text says he's with his disciples, and he says to his disciples, you are my mother, brother, and sisters, implying that there were men and women in this space, that it was not just men in that space. So I think, again, these are kind of just asides that we don't necessarily notice when we're reading through the text, and I think are important because I think one of the things, like I said, it somewhat demonstrates that it was just so normal with Jesus that they're not taking time to point it out and be like, can you believe this?
Yeah.
Right.
That's interesting. So the for anybody who's interested, the passage Don was just talking about was Matthew 12:46-50. And I never picked up on that before. Because it's his mother and brothers who are outside, but then
he mentions sisters.
He says sister.
Yeah, he adds that. Yeah, can you read that for us?
Sure. Hang on one moment.
I'm glad that you did confirm my memory. I'm always a little nervous going from memory.
Okay. While he was still speaking to the crowds, his mother and his brothers were standing outside wanting to speak to him. Someone told him, "Look, your mother and your brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you." But to the one who had told him this, Jesus replied, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" And pointing to his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother."
Yep. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. It's interesting because of all the different verses that were going through my mind when you were like, oh, here's this one just did not pop up at all because I never picked up on that. And that feels very deliberate.
Well, I don't even think it's that Jesus is trying to make an inclusive statement of women there. I think it's just that so naturally part of what Jesus was doing that it was just recorded.
It's interesting that you say that because I feel like either way, the point is made. If it was just such a natural part of things, well, then the point is made that women were disciples too. If he was making a point, then the point is that Jesus supports women. So it's like either way,
yeah,
you can't get away from the fact that Jesus supported women.
Yeah, I think for me, what does feel important there, and it's probably splitting hairs, which I'm good at, is that I think I prefer a Jesus that was just like, well, yeah, of course. Of course I'm discipling women. It didn't even cross my mind to make a special point to point that out. Just, yes, that's what I'm doing. And again, that's, like I said, it's preference that I kind of want to see Jesus through that lens.
Well, do you think part of that, I'm sorry, Sarah, do you think part of that is because of this is how it's been interpreted now. It's like you want Jesus to be explicitly like, I'm saying this because the church has, acted how it has about women.
Maybe I think more so for me, it's that I'm so tired of hearing so-and-so's a female pastor or such and such church is a gay church, right? Or a welcoming church. Like, I'm just tired of those things. I just know so-and-so is a pastor,
Right.
and such place is a church.
Right.
Stop giving adjectives. Stop making it unique. Instead, normalize it. And I think that's what does it for my mind. So yeah, so maybe it is in reaction. I don't know. But,
Well, and I remember you saying in the past that you want the exclusive churches to have to label themselves instead.
right. I would rather, instead of being a church that an inclusive church, that other churches have to say we're a non-inclusive church.
Right.
I'd rather them be forced into labels as opposed to that. Sarah, you were going to say
I think
something.
I talked over you. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Well, I was just thinking when you were talking about places where you see daughters mentioned, that in Acts 2 and Peter, and he's actually quoting Joel from the Old Testament, and it will be in the last days, says God, that I will pour out my spirit on all humanity, that your sons and your daughters will prophesy.
Oh, right.
Your young men will see visions, and your old men will dream dreams. And just a blatant reference to daughters prophesying,
Yep.
which can easily be overlooked.
Yeah.
And I think, maybe we should move and kind of at least bring up the problematic texts that
Sure.
with women in the church, because I think this one, this just reminds me that that a lot of people like to say that women need to be silent in the church because of what Paul says. Or I think there's a verse in Timothy, maybe 1 Timothy, similar along lines of quiet and silence and submission and things like that.
Yeah.
But I think we should at least touch on those.
So for those two, they're both taking place in the city of Ephesus. And the city of Ephesus is basically like Jerusalem is for Yahweh, Ephesus is for Artemis. And Artemis's main temple, Judaism is odd that it only has one temple. Almost all the other faiths, in fact, every faith I've come across, or other gods or goddesses I've come across in antiquity, had multiple temples. So, Yahweh's unique in only having a singular temple. But Artemis's main temple is in Ephesus. And there's lots of interesting things that go on. And I really encourage you to, read, study, look up Artemis. Artemis and Diana, so Greek and Roman goddess, kind of merged and became this ultimate goddess. And Artemis women were the ones that were in power. They were the dominant gender. Men would often, in order to participate in any of the cult practices of Artemis, had to be castrated. And there was all these rituals and stuff that went along with that. In fact, when I was in Turkey, one of the coolest things was we came across an Artemis temple, and attached to the back of it was a Christian church that evidence points to that they provided medical attention to the men that were castrated in order to be a part of the Artemis cult. And if you think about that, I just don't see churches offering that kind of service nowadays, right? Like, if you're going to do that, well, that's your problem,
Right. Yeah.
But instead, you have this church. So there was a lot of things within the Artemis cult that were basically opposite of a lot of the teachings of Torah. And so in a lot of ways, there was just confrontation. And this goes back to this idea of not allowing two different ways of expressing faith and worship to combine and start to paganize Judaism, right? And so one of the dangers that was being faced in Ephesus, according to all the details we have, is that a lot of this theology started seeping in, like a combination of pagan ideas about worship and Jewish ideas about worship, and they were starting to get muddied. And the main people that were muddying it at the time were women. And it was because they were the ones that were in power. They were the authority in their space. And Paul seemingly is saying, I tell you what, I need you to sit down and listen and learn more before you get up and start teaching. I don't know if there's patriarchal mindset in there. There very well could be. But I can tell you that at least some of it was because of the setting. Because we don't see Paul saying that to any other people, any other church, except for the church in Ephesus. So he says it in the book of Ephesians, and he says it in his letter to Timothy, in Timothy's letter. And so we see it in those spaces, and it is specific to that city. Unfortunately, like we do with a lot of things, we don't necessarily recognize that the epistles were written to a unique church in a unique space, in a unique situation, and we should not make it universal. It's descriptive of what's going on in Ephesus, but it's not necessarily prescriptive for everything. And we make a huge mistake, particularly with Paul's writings, by making it prescriptive instead of descriptive.
Yeah, so I saw a post on Facebook that it was like, what determines if something is prescriptive or descriptive? And they were just like looking for responses. And it's funny, this random thing that I follow, their questions are usually much more just like, I don't know, not that this is totally like off the wall. And I never respond, but as like, I responded, I just said genre. And I don't think it's an all-inclusive answer. But in this case, too, genre is a big clue of if we're talking about prescriptive or descriptive.
Yeah.
Well, and isn't there a letter where Paul praises a female leader? Am I making that up?
No, I want to say it's... let me just say this. Where it gets complicated is there's a lot of epistles that have historically... or traditionally, maybe is a better way to say it, been attributed to Paul, that now that we are able to do more in-depth comparisons of language usage, patterns of speech, etc., that have now been declared were not Paul. But someone maybe who was a disciple of Paul wrote this and so wrote it very similarly. So I want to be careful. I believe in the epistle of Thessalonians, that there is that, but I'm not 100% certain.
Well, and you had mentioned Priscilla and Aquila earlier.
Yeah.
And that one is my quick search. He says, give my greetings to Priscilla and Aquila, my co-workers in the ministry of Christ Jesus. Mm-hmm. That's kind of a...
Yeah, I mean, co-workers. Well, yeah. And the thing is and maybe we can put a link in the description to this photo. There are paintings that have been found in first century churches where it has a woman drawn, and in that time there were different hand signals, different ways of holding your hand, kind of like, Cub Scouts or Boy Scout type thing, Girl Scout type salutes, that if you held your hand a certain way, it indicated your role in the church. And so there's a painting of a woman holding her hand up in the gesture of a teacher. And the other thing that's important with that imagery is that the stature of the person was demonstrated by the height of the painting of that person. And so if you were taller than everybody else, that meant you were the leader. Mm-hmm. And there are paintings that has a woman next to a painting of Paul, both with their hands held up in the sign of a teacher, and they're the same height. And that is extremely significant to, again, demonstrate we have a mindset that Paul is misogynistic and patriarchal, And maybe comparatively to today's standards, he was, right? But we also see these moments and these glimpses that Paul is not those things. And so we are left to determine when we're interpreting the text, which assumption are we going to make of Paul when we're reading his letters? And this is super important for anything, right? Like if we believe God is misogynistic, then we can read places in the Hebrew text that says if you want to accuse your wife of adultery, you can drag her into the temple and make her drink dirt off the floor of the temple. And you can read it through that lens as a misogynist and go, see? Or as God is a misogynist and therefore dismiss God as misogynistic. Or you can read it as God protected women, and one of the worst things you could do would be to strike out the name of God. And in order to do this test, you had to be willing to strike God's name out twice, because the priest would write on the I forget what the term is, but I'm gonna say parchment. I don't know that it was parchment. I'm not gonna guess. I just guessed, but I don't want to guess further. But in that scribing has to write out a blessing and a curse from God and uses God's name in it. Mm-hmm. And if you don't know this, when a Torah scroll is replaced, the rabbis will go through and cut out every place that Yahweh is mentioned and keep it in a box and then destroy the rest of the scroll, because we are not allowed to scratch out the name of God. So in this curse for this woman, the guy that's accusing him has to be willing to walk into God's front door, into the house of God, tell God, no, I'm so convinced that this is what happened, and be wanting to see the innards of the woman fall out onto the ground, which is horrible. Mm-hmm. And so there's actually no evidence that anyone ever took up this opportunity. God made it so clear in that passage, to do this is to put everything at risk. Is that what you want to do? And we read it and go, this was something that guys did every other day. But there's no evidence that anyone ever did it because it was such a drastic measure to accuse someone, which was very different than a lot of the other cultures surrounding Israel that would just discard women very quickly. And so again, God, you could read that and go, wait, no, God was actually protecting women with this law. And we read it as, what a jerk. Right?
Yeah. And with the Priscilla and Aquila, I wanted to circle back to that because I don't think we mentioned too that the significance of her name being said first. That I think it's every time it's in the scriptures that it's distinctly Priscilla and then her husband's name, Aquila. Mm-hmm. And then also that when it's talked about Apollos, it says they taught Apollos. So presumably they were both teaching.
Well, when he was in Sunday school, Priscilla was doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think when you were talking about the woman that Paul celebrates, I think you might have been thinking of Phoebe.
I think,
which is right. Romans 16.
See, I was so close with Thessalonians.
I commend to you, 16:1, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, who is a servant of the church in Cenchreae. So you should welcome her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints, and assist her in whatever matter she may require your help. For indeed, she has been a benefactor of many, and of me also. And right after it goes into the give my greetings to Prisca and Aquila, my co-workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their own necks for my life. Not only do I thank them, but so do all the Gentile churches.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what we are demonstrating today, and we're not even going, I mean, Miriam was called a prophetess. The first person to own a plot of land and reside in it in Israel, in the Promised Land, is Sarah. Yes, it's at her death, and she's buried there, but she's the first Jewish person buried in the Promised Land. So there's all these moments throughout the text that are very clear about God's view, Jesus's view, Paul's view of women, that I would argue we have been victims of twisted interpretations of the passages of the Bible in order to arrive where we have. That doesn't mean that there aren't complicated passages, ones that are difficult to understand, ones that are difficult and feel hurtful, and we need to wrestle with those. But the litany of positive passages in regards to women throughout the text are so significant that to pretend that the Bible does not value women in all roles, in all leadership scenarios, right? John 1, here's an example we often don't make about women, but John 1, where John says, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and all things were created through the Word, all that section is quoting Proverbs and the language about wisdom. And wisdom is a she. So I think, again, it's really important for us to recognize all of these moments, whether it's God as mother hen, whether it's God as many-breasted one, whether it's Miriam the prophetess, whether it's a judge that is a woman, the list just goes on. The story of Exodus being defined by women and daughters, and all of this stuff is just so powerful. And unfortunately, in us interjecting our own patriarchy on the text, we have actually missed out on a lot of really potentially beautiful teachings and stories that could be edifying for the entire church. And I would argue, and uniquely for girls in the church, to see these women exerting their power and their influence and being a vehicle of God's to bring wonder to the world.
Yeah, and kind of summary of what you were just saying, we shouldn't take a passage that we're not sure about and use that to create theology when passages that are much more certain or clear. I know we like to steer away from saying the Bible is clear, but you can't really deny that Deborah was a judge.
Right.
And Huldah was a prophetess. But so to take a passage that has room for debate and build a theology around it against, like you said, a litany of other things. We shouldn't take what's a little bit in the dark or we should interpret what's in the dark by what's more in the light.
Yes. Absolutely. And we do it all the time.
I love that line.
Yeah.
And we need to be careful.
Yeah.
I really like that a lot.
Can you say it again? I know it had litany in it.
Oh, well, the idea of that we shouldn't take what's somewhat in the dark and interpret, or we should take what's in the dark and interpret it more by what's in the light. So what's prevalent throughout the text.
Yes.
Yeah, we don't do that, do we? And I know we're getting close to the end here, but you also, when you mentioned Proverbs, it made me think about Proverbs 31. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to me because I feel like sometimes people read that and somehow make it about like a woman taking care of her household in a way that's just like a submissive way.
Servanthood.
Yeah. But
that's the most baller human being in the Bible.
Yeah, I mean, she runs the household. She does the finances. Isn't there something about her instructing purchase of land or something? Like maybe I'm making that up. I don't remember the exact. But I mean, she's just doing all this stuff, and it's not at all submissive.
Oh no.
And so it's interesting to me that people are like, a Proverbs 31 woman.
Oh yeah.
would be, I don't remember how they say it, but it's very flowery and insinuates that women are tiny and submissive and demure.
See, I didn't really take it that way. I've always taken it more so as so it's interesting to hear that from your perspective, that's how you heard it. What I heard it as growing up in a patriarchal church was that I could expect dinner to be made and my home to be clean when I got
that
home.
too. Yeah.
And it didn't, to me, have to do with being, tiny.
Well, I think I think where my interpretation of that is coming up, and I think by tiny, I'm combining a bunch of things in my head. One is tiny as in you don't take up too much room. You don't take up more room than you need to. And then the other is that the way that this Proverbs 31 has been layered on things is very much, to me, melded in with the image of the 50s housewife, where, not only is dinner ready on the table and your slippers by your favorite reading chair, when you get home from your hard day of work.
Don't forget my pipe.
And your pipe and your newspaper. And the kids are silent and don't bother you. But the woman is doing it in heels with a frilly dress on and is always made up. And you know what I mean? So it's not only is that sort of more practical part of it, like that you're getting what you need, but it's also done with like
glamour.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. And I think that it's a lot of women can feel shame from Proverbs 31 because they're not living up to all that.
Right.
But I think it being in the Proverbs, that it should be interpreted more like poetry. Like we're celebrating the wonderful aspects of women, or like social media when you take a family photo and you get that family photo where all the kids are smiling, but it doesn't tell you of like all the chaos that happened before and after that picture. That like this is a picture of things to celebrate about women, but it's not implying that all these things are happening every single moment.
Right.
Because I do know a lot of women who do many things on that list, but they're not doing it every single day. They're not, it's like, yeah. So just, it's not like a burden to be worn on our shoulders. It's celebrating the amazing things that women are capable of.
I think Rachel Held Evans wrote something along those very similar to those lines that you're saying, and how it was, these are the virtues of women, not that that if you're not doing this, you are not a virtuous woman. Like that these are things to be seen individually apart from one another. And I don't remember exactly how Rachel Held Evans wrote that.
Yeah, she would I can't remember the Hebrew, but she would say, something that was basically like, praise you, virtuous woman, to women who were doing amazing things.
So can I ask you two a question? Have you come across, there's like a TikTok trend right now that is trad wives or trad wives or trad wife.
I'm assuming trad is traditional?
Yes.
Okay.
And where there's all these TikToks of particularly young, like early 20-something women who are talking about being submissive to their husbands and taking on a very 50s kind of imagery of the role of women. And there's one that I saw where the young woman, she looks like maybe she's 21, 22, and it looks like she had been crying. And she's talking about how even if your husband's not a believer, that you're called to continue to dote upon them in the hopes that someday they will convert. Now, I have no problem with a believer marrying a non-believer, anything like that. But with her, I mean, the only thing I could walk away thinking is this woman has been harmed and she's in an unhealthy relationship right now. And she feels obligated to stay because of this mindset of being a trad wife. But have either of you come across this new TikTok?
No.
Like
No,
when
I
you think
haven't.
about TikTok trends, that is not the direction you expect TikTok trends to go. You expect to be eating Tide Pods or something.
No, but I have heard there being, different movements of women going back to that sort of complementarian, traditional housewife kind of thing. And here's the thing, I think, I'm the type of feminist who says if you want to be a stay-at-home mom, you want to be a housewife, good. You want to have a job, good. Like either one of those is fine. I think
Again, descriptive versus prescriptive.
Right, and that's where it comes in. Where I think it sounds like I don't know what this trend is, but it sounds like that could be leaning more towards the prescriptive of like, well, this is the woman's role is to.
Oh, it's 100% that.
Yeah, and that I don't agree with.
And you're missing out if you're not doing it this way.
Right, or that you're offending God and
Right.
you are in some way harmful to the future of faith.
Right.
I only saw 2 of them, and I was watching it via someone else kind of reacting to the trend. But the other young woman that was featured in that, she had like a list on her screen of like all these things that she was supposed to be aware of and that she was educating women on to be a trad wife, which just sounds terrible to even say, right? The problem is like 5 or 6 of them were good things. Mm-hmm. Like they were actually like universal. They had nothing to do with being a trad wife, so to speak. Mm-hmm. They had to do with, health and well-being and stuff like that. But that's when it gets dangerous, in my opinion, is when you mix a list of 10 things and 7 of them are good and true and could be prescriptive, right? But then you throw in a dash of 3 descriptive things, and now all of a sudden it becomes confused in the way it's being communicated and is super harmful.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. What you could almost use that technique intentionally if you wanted to like sway somebody, like hide things within like all these. Yeah.
Well,
Wow.
and I think people do that a little bit even more nefariously where they frame things in a positive way. Like, well, all I want to do is love my husband. What's wrong with that? Are you saying I shouldn't love my husband? Like, there's so many ways you really could reframe things and be like, how could you possibly argue?
Well, and in sales, it used to be taught, I don't know that it is any longer, but it used to be taught that you need to get people to say yes a certain number of times before you do the final pitch, because then they're in a pattern of agreement. Mm-hmm. And so you increase the opportunity that they will ultimately say yes to what you're trying to sell them. And so to me, this kind of fits in that. You get people to read 7 of 10 things and they're going, yeah, absolutely. This is good stuff. And if this person has that kind of insight into this good stuff, well, then this also must be good stuff.
Right. Yes. And that is very intentional.
Yeah. And it's sad to see young women doing it to themselves.
Right. Yeah.
And others.
Yeah. Well, there are so many other things we could talk about women in the Bible. So I have a feeling we're going to return to this topic multiple times in the future to dissect different passages and things. But we're at the end of our time for today. So are there any parting thoughts from either of you before we call it a day?
I don't think so. I think we summed it up pretty well. Did you have anything, Don?
I think I just, as a pastor, as a male, I just want to, one, as best as I can, express empathy for what women have gone through in the church and the pastors and preachers and teachers and scholars we've missed out on over generations because of these teachings or this way of viewing the Bible. I think it's horrible, and I'm sorry that the church has done those things to so many women. I want to encourage women that your church might attempt to minimize what you can be in the eyes of God, but God does not hold that same position. The text is very clear on God's view of women, and that is that you might actually be the superstars of the Bible, not the add-ons, not the sidekicks, but rather the actual heroes. It is through women that our faith continues according to the text. So,
good. I want to just go back to what Sarah said and say we should interpret what's in the dark by what's in the light. And I think that's the thought I want to leave with people, that don't allow centuries of misogyny to color your vision of God's love for women. I think that's what I want to end on. So thank you for joining us today. We hope you'll join us next time. And in the meantime, you can find us on Twitch at 8 p.m. Eastern on Mondays and Thursdays, and at our website, ancientjesusfuturefaith.com. And you can email us at info@ancientjesusfuturefaith.com if you have any questions or suggested topic for an upcoming podcast. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
bye.